So, welcome everyone. I'm going to make a start because we've got this precious hour and I don't want it to run over. So if I could just ask everybody, please, just to put themselves on mute, just so that we don't have interference when I'm speaking and when then Lee is speaking. So firstly, I just want to say a massive, massive welcome to you all. It's incredible.
Oh, no, I don't want to annoy you. No,
yeah,
don't be silly.
just put yourself on mute, please.
Sorry, Jen, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jane Osgood. I'm Professor of Education at the Centre for Education Research Scholarship, Middlesex University, and I chair the Childhood and Society Special Interest Group Network. And part of that work, this Childhood and Society Sign, is this seminar series, which has been running now since 2015. And we normally have a very lively lineup, a very lively programme of seminars. Historically, it's always been face-to-face, and so it's really interesting to see what's possible when you send it out into Zoomosphere, and we find that the attendance is threefold. So that's wonderful. It's really, really great to have you all with us. So just a little bit about the series itself. The aim is to provide an opportunity for our educational researchers at Middlesex to share their work with their colleagues, to share their work with their students, and to share their work with the wider world. And we have, as you'll see, across the programme, we have a very wide range of expertise, a very wide range of research in childhood studies at Middlesex, and that's represented in our Childhood and Society Signs seminar series. And it's a very inclusive space, so we have presentations from PhD students right through to professor, and everybody's welcome to come and present their work at whatever stage it might be. So if you're there and you're grappling with an aspect of your research, then just come to me and we can find space for you in this programme. So the 2021 seminar series, we have 14 seminars lined up, and we're experimenting again with the timing of the sessions, and we're going for a lunchtime session, 12 to 12:45 every other Monday. So from now until Christmas, we have 14 seminars lined up. And this is to showcase the research undertaken by Middlesex educational researchers. And it covers a range of theories, theoretical orientations, theorists, philosophers, a whole range of different approaches to pedagogy and practice, and presents a range of research innovations and traditions. And what unites everything that we do, despite that diversity, is that it's about children, families, parents and communities, and it's critical. So we're in pursuit of a social justice agenda in all the work that we do, despite that diversity. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have persuaded Lee to kick off the series. So we have Associate Professor Lee Jerome, who will be speaking today about the transformational potential of Freires. And he is an expert on children's rights, teacher education and citizenship education. And he's presenting from his either forthcoming or very recently released book, Children's Rights in Diverse Classrooms. Now, I'll be chairing the session. I encourage you to please put any questions or comments that you have in the Q&A, and we'll gather up those questions and comments and relay them to Lee towards the end. He's going to finish speaking around 12:30. And at that point, we'll have a Q&A session. And if it's possible and feasible, then you'll be invited to actually present your question to him. So another date for your diary is the 22nd. That's the next seminar in the series, seminar number 2. And that will be me presenting on childhood in the Anthropocene. But I'm not going to take up any further time. I'm going to introduce Lee and hope that his technology is working.
Okay.
Yes.
Lovely. Thank you. Is that visible to people? Yeah, great. So thanks very much, Jane. I'm going to kind of crack on fairly swiftly, and but I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. So my interest in Freire comes as someone who's been involved with citizenship education for the last 20 years, and then more recently children's rights and human rights education. So I started, well, we converted a teacher training course we ran at London Met to be a rights respecting programme, following the Rights Respecting Schools Award that UNICEF had been running with schools for a long time. And then I went to work for a couple of years at the Centre for Children's Rights. It's nice to see some faces that I met there. And that gave me the opportunity to really think about what's distinctive about children's rights in this broad field of citizenship and human rights education. And so I had the opportunity to meet with a bunch of people doing a master's in children's rights and think about pedagogy. And so this grew out of reflections and conversations there where we tried to go back to some key educational thinkers and think about how they might inform the contemporary conversation about children's rights education, even though they weren't necessarily writing about that. So that's the kind of context of the presentation. And then this is how it's kind of finding expression. So I've been working with Hugh Starkey, who's written loads about human rights education over the years with Audrey Osler and on his own. And this is the book we've come up with. So I'm talking about a chapter today, and I've struggled for a long time to think about how to try and squeeze a chapter into 25 minutes, and I'm not going to do that. So I've put the chapter in the chat, and you're welcome to email me if you've missed it or you can't download it. And I'm happy for people to kind of have a read of that. And what I'm going to do today is slightly more eclectic than go through the structured argument in the abstract. And it's just to kind of bounce between saying some stuff about Freire and some stuff about children's rights to illustrate the kinds of connections that I think are useful to make. And then at the end, just try and pull that together to give it a bit of coherence anyway. At least you can see where I'm coming from and what I'm doing, even if in the discussion afterwards you want to disagree with it. So one of the things I'm very keen on is exploring teachers' professional agency. And whilst I've become quite interested in human rights education, there is a tendency in some quarters to defer to human rights specialists who are often international legal scholars. And I find it politically and professionally slightly challenging to be put in that role, which Stephen Ball has described as a readerly role, where policy and practice documents are delivered and the teacher's job is to read it and do what they're told. So going back to people like Freire for me is part of going back and rediscovering what educationalists have been saying for a long time that might provide a useful foundation for us as teachers to come back and think about our role and our distinctive contribution outside of just that legal interpretive context. So that's where the book comes from. The first thing I'm going to say by way of introduction about children's rights is just this observation, that children's rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child obviously commits states, which is almost every country on the planet, to provide an education. It's Article 28. But also it's important to remember that the very next article, 29, talks about what kind of an education it is that states should be providing children. So this is the article in its entirety, in its opening statements, really. And it just reminds us that it is focused on individuals flourishing on their own terms. It foregrounds values because it says at the very outset that education should be values driven. It should overtly promote a culture of human rights. It should be locally rooted in respect for local communities and community practices. It should be democratic and inclusive and respectful of the environment. So Article 29 is explicitly about a values statement to underpin all of our educational efforts. It doesn't say every child should be taught literacy and numeracy and should have a fair chance to do well in PISA league table examinations. It doesn't say any of that. Those are additional things to their rights. And in interpreting this article, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is the UN body that oversees the implementation of the convention, issued its first general comment to explore and explain what Article 29 meant. And this has always stood out for me as a really significant comment. It should be emphasized that the type of teaching that's focused primarily on the accumulation of knowledge, competition, and an excessive burden of work may seriously hamper the harmonious development of the child to the fullest potential. So what they're saying is, if anyone who's working in education in England will recognize that as a kind of warning sign. So my starting point for children's rights is that it poses some uncomfortable challenges for teachers, and schools can't rest back on their laurels and think that just having inclusive provision or inclusive access is enough. We need to really reflect deeply on what we do and how that sits with a commitment to children's rights. So that it takes us back to Freire. And I think the most important thing to say about Freire at the outset is that oppression is absolutely running through everything he writes about. Okay, so we have to think about the nature of oppression, and we have to think about how that arises in society, and we have to think about the struggle for something better. Now, if you've just committed to those values that I was talking about in Article 29, then it's not a massive leap to get to an understanding of why oppression is important. But of course, most important thing about oppression is that you have to understand it so that you can seek liberation. And the achievement of liberation in Freirean terms is a more complete realization of our humanity. It's to rehumanize our lives. So a pedagogy of the oppressed for Freire makes oppression and its causes the objects of reflection. So the fact of oppression has to sit at the heart of what we teach and our understanding of what pedagogy is. But he doesn't just have some simplistic assumption that if you tell people about oppression, then they'll all gang together and end it in 6 months. It's not that kind of simplistic process. And he's aware that there are at least 4 possible outcomes from exposing people to an understanding of their oppression. The first outcome, not in kind of sequential order, but the first that I'm going to mention is that the oppressed, if they liberate themselves from their oppressor, simply replace the oppressor. So the oppressed of yesterday become the oppressors of tomorrow, and they switch roles. That doesn't do anything for liberation because it just puts different people in the same essential relationship between oppressor and oppressed. But that's a perfectly kind of observable outcome for the struggle against oppression. The second outcome that has been the topic of conversation an awful lot at the moment because of Trump's 4 years in power is that a perfectly rational psychological response is to defer to a strong leader who will remedy the situation for you. So you realize that you're oppressed, you realize that there are some fundamental injustices, and you defer to someone who's going to sort it out for you. The third example is that you just give up and shop and watch telly and withdraw from the political world. And the fourth possibility is that you seek authentic freedom and liberation. And that is what Freire is interested in, but he's not interested in something like establishing social mobility in a fundamentally unequal and unjust society. He's talking about challenging the nature of injustice in unequal societies. The next thing I want to say, just by way of introduction very quickly, is to kind of remind ourselves of where Freire sits. He's writing around his first major work around 1968, the year of revolution, the year of counterculture, of the height of anti-Vietnam War process, of students rioting on the streets, the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So a tumultuous year, but also a time when there was a lot of optimism and a lot of amazing kind of liberatory thinking in the countercultural movement. A lot of his work is clearly inspired by Marx, that notion of the oppressed and the oppressors and the struggle for liberation, and this being essentially a kind of historical struggle of economic and social forces, is clearly inspired by Marxism. But that notion of how you psychologically respond to that reality is drawing on the work of Fromm, who is trying to understand how individuals cope in a world of these extreme economic and political forces. And also he's writing shortly after Frantz Fanon wrote Black Skin, White Mask and introduced us to the kind of the really deep psychological damage that happens to everyone in a society that has these kinds of relationships between oppressed and oppressors, in his example, through colonial systems of government and oppression. And working in Latin America, he's drawing on the tradition of liberation theology, which is using the teaching of Christ to try and ask some of these questions about what the church might do to tackle poverty and justice. So all of these ideas are swirling around in 1968 in intellectual circles, and Freire draws on them all. So to understand the kind of life, or to simplify a life, as we have to if we're going to kind of trot through it and then just kind of pinch some ideas from it, it's worth just getting a bit of an overview. So Freire spends a good deal of his early professional life developing this pedagogy for promoting adult literacy among peasant groups in Brazil. And by the end of that process, it's so kind of acknowledged as so valuable and so effective and so significant that the rollout plans, before it all comes to a terrible end, include kind of plans for 2,000 different cultural circles where this work can happen. Then the military coup, his imprisonment, his exile, and then the writing of this book in 1968, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So written in the middle of these kind of intense political tumultuous times, then goes off to get a position in America, and then has this position with the World Council of Churches, hence the relevance of liberation theology, which gives him the opportunity to travel around the world to meet people who are part of these liberation struggles and to talk to people about the role that education plays in those broader movements. And then later the opportunity to return to Brazil and to put some of these ideas into practice as Secretary of Education in Sao Paulo. So a kind of an amazing arc of a life that begins and ends with teachers in Brazil, but has this kind of amazing global experience in the middle. So the premise of Pedagogy of the Oppressed is this, really, that people have to come to understand the nature of their oppression. They have to come to understand the nature of the struggle for liberation, but they can't see it as a closed world. They have to see it as a pretty terrible situation, but one that is open to transformation. In other words, there is a bit of the kind of revelatory role of education, but it's really important to align that with establishing a sense of hope that things can get better, and agency that we are the very people that can contribute to it getting better. So I'm now going to just kind of cherry pick 4 ideas that seem to me to be particularly kind of rich to help inform children's rights education. And for each idea, I'll just give you a glimpse of what Freire said, and then say something about how I think it connects with developing child rights education pedagogies, or how I'm trying to use it to shed light on that problem. So on neutrality, in a way, this is the most famous quote, and I used to use this to start our first PGCE lecture, and then I realized a bit later than I should have done that this is not, as often happens, this is not Freire's actual wording, but if you Google this quote, then it always comes up as Freire. There's no such thing as neutral education. It either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. That's actually Richard Schall's introduction to the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but from the quote underneath you can see that it's a perfectly reasonable summary of Freire's position. In other words, especially in our current climate, and thinking about the kind of current advice that is coming from the government about how to engage with political education in schools, it's really important to kind of think about this at a systemic level. We know that our school system routinely reproduces the patterns of inequality that mar the society in general. A neutral school system reproduces inequality and therefore reproduces injustice. So a neutral person in that system is playing an active part in reproducing the inequalities that we want to tackle. So you can't afford to attempt to be politically neutral. You have to intervene. You have to be on the side of justice. So what does that look like? Well, when I was at London Met, it struck us slightly, in a slightly cynical way, that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a really helpful way to be radical without sounding like you're radical. So it's fine being a neo-Marxist critical pedagogue if that's what everyone thinks is great. But if you're trying to get government funding and pass an Ofsted inspection, then spouting on about the evils of neoliberalism and quoting McLaren probably won't get you very far. So for us, there was something really useful about seizing the Convention of the Rights of the Child as a utopian values vision, a commitment that our teaching should completely be saturated with a set of values, which are to enhance freedom, democracy, and human rights. But our government signed up to it. Most governments have. There is some kind of reassurance that this is not a partisan perspective, even though it gives you a position from which to be politically radical. And here's a nice example from Kishore Singh's Special Rapporteur report in 2014 about how that flows through. He talked about the kind of the creep of private provision throughout the world as being by definition detrimental to education, because the market values are in opposition to the humanistic values that underpin human rights. And he quotes Macpherson approvingly to kind of justify his argument. But it's just useful for me to kind of always remind myself that this is a fairly mainstream interpretation of the convention. It's aspects of our education policy infrastructure which are actually odd rather than this humanizing discourse. So the second thing that Freire talks about, which is interesting for a child rights educator, is to question the notion of authority. So this kind of summarizes his commitment to a form of education which is driven by mutual regard and mutual relationships. And this lovely idea that whenever we teach, we should always approach that act of teaching as a mechanism for learning about the people that we're teaching. So we learn about their lives, we learn about their learning process, we learn about the world from their perspective, and we have to be open to that. Otherwise, there's no genuine exchange. What it means in practice is we have to reject this banking notion of education, which is the teacher is decanting knowledge into relatively empty vessels as fast and efficiently as they can. And one of his problems with that is that it leads the teacher to confuse the authority they have because of their knowledge expertise with all aspects of professional authority. And there is a resurgence of this with some people who are revisiting kind of traditional educational ideas at the moment, that I think Freire would really take objection to. That of course it doesn't mean that there's no such thing as the correct knowledge that we're talking about in the curriculum, but just because you are the default person to be the arbiter of correct knowledge, it does, because of your degree and your postgraduate qualification and all the rest of it, it doesn't mean that you are the ultimate voice or the first voice to be heard on all other aspects of how we conduct this shared mutual life together in the classroom. So he's committed to a rejection of banking education. And where I think we go with this in children's rights education language is to remind ourselves of Article 12, which is a way to commit to the fact that we shouldn't be the only voice in the classroom. And Laura Lundy's conceptualization of this is really helpful because it just spells out what that would look like in practice. That student voice is not just saying to children, what do you think? It's giving them the space to, that's my 5-minute warning, to express a view, but also to develop an informed view, to practice giving those views, then to express them in a reasonable context. They have to have some reassurance that they're not just shouting in the wind, that someone is listening to them. And it's got to be someone's job to respond, even if it's to come back with an explanation of why things can't happen in the way that they would request or in the timescale they would want. So there's a very practical kind of methodology developed by children's rights activists that I think fulfills some of this vision about a more mutual, reciprocal teaching and learning relationship. And there's a lovely example here from UNICEF, a group of young people in Scotland who were studying poverty in relation to human rights, and their project, they got funding together and produced a video and an education pack, which is genuinely one of the best education resources I've ever seen, which is a study of poverty, but it is not done in some kind of global terms or some charity-driven terms. It is done through an exploration of lived poverty in the school community where the children worked. And this is what the children said was the purpose behind their project. So they are doing human rights education in completely serious and rigorous terms, but it's growing out of their observations and their concerns. And what they're really concerned to do is to stop people in the West thinking poverty is about people in Africa and we need to raise money through a non-uniform day or a bring and buy sale or something. It's on our doorstep, and we have to understand that, and we have to understand the relationships that give rise to that. So that commitment to mutuality and voice leads Freire to promote dialogue. I think the most important thing I'm going to say about dialogue here is that it's not a teaching tactic to get kids engaged. It is a fundamental mechanism for engaging with the world and each other in the world critically. And Dada says her interpretation of where Freire is coming from is this notion that thinking itself is better done in a collaborative sense in the learning context. Before you can get to the position of stating what you think, you have to engage in a conversation with the community. Bringing this back to children's rights, it seems to me it's almost impossible to have an honest conversation with children about children's rights or human rights without acknowledging that they are always in tension, and they always have to be thrashed out through a deliberative process so they can be defined for a particular group or individual in a particular context at a particular time. And it's that process of deliberating rights which is at the heart, I think, of understanding what rights are and how they're realized. So borrowing from Freire's commitment to dialogue and applying it to human rights, we get to a kind of an understanding of what it is to know what a human right is and how human rights are made relevant to individual situations. A lovely example of this on our doorstep in Newham, School 21, which is a school committed to developing oracy at the heart of their curriculum, have written about an amazing campaign where they trained the children in their Spanish lessons to work for and with Latin American women's organizations to campaign for a living wage for Latin American women doing relatively low qualified, menial, low paid work in the school and in local authority buildings and in the kind of local businesses in their neighborhood. So a kind of fantastic example where the Spanish and the dialogue and the politics and the local coalition building all comes together, so that you're not doing this in addition to the, or, you know, as an aside to the curriculum. This is the way that you develop the curriculum. And then the final thing I want to say about dialogue is that the purpose is to lead to conscientisation. And again, what Freire was committed to was this notion that conscientisation, this raising of people's consciousness of their position in this exploitative set of relationships, this is not something you can give as the oh so clever, committed political educator. This is something that has to be hammered out in conversation with people, which means you have to really engage with where they're at and see the world from their perspective. It also means that you can't espouse a kind of revolutionary, Leninist, vanguardist approach where you lead the masses to the light through your clever political leadership. You have to work with them to find the solutions that will work for them. And it's not just a kind of cognitive understanding. This is about working with them so that they can see their own cultural and political agency in the situation. So what does that mean for human rights? Well, it means we move away from simply teaching about the declarations. Keats has talked about a declarationist tendency. And it means, I love this quote from Bill Bowring, that we move towards seeing human rights as crystallized moments of the revolutionary spirit, that we teach children that rights are international agreements and documents, but the realization of rights is about struggle. It's about building common ground between people, and it's about holding governments to account and engaging communities and movements in struggle. So learning about human rights defenders is a really obvious kind of pedagogic strategy to do that. And I was involved with a little project with the Robert Kennedy project where it was just lovely to see young people, 12-year-olds in Kent, completely transfixed by learning about Ugandan gay rights campaigners or Russian domestic violence campaigners, and writing to these people to express their kind of their high regard for what they're doing, to say, well, you're so brave, carry on the good fight, but also think about, what is there something we can do to promote awareness of their work? Is there something we can do to support them? Is there something we can do to join campaigns that are trying to achieve the same aim? So using people and the process of struggle seems to be fantastic in terms of pedagogy and engaging young people, but also the most likely to lead to some level of conscientisation. So I'm going to end very quickly in the next 2-3 minutes with this lovely image of Guritz's cross in the box. And McLaren says this is a really useful visual metaphor for thinking about what people do correctly and incorrectly with Freire. So on the one hand, you have this lovely furled up gold box. And he says Freire can be presented like this, a nice shiny thing, which is all about class councils and teachers who talk nicely to children and cultural literacy for marginalized groups. But actually, what's fantastic about Guritz's box is that it unfolds into the cross on the bottom. And what's important about the cross is that it has these razor-sharp needles. And what McLaren says is that version of Freire is the one that calls attention to the totality of capitalist social relations that lead to exploitation and alienation. As Freire would say, that lead to oppression, as we might say, that lead to the routine denial of human rights to individuals and historically, repetitively marginalized groups. So very quickly onto the last step, I'm trying to think about how do we avoid being hypocritical when we say we are adopting children's rights education as a transformational educational approach when we're often not being very transformational. All of what Freire has said, I think we draw on to try to be transformational, but an awful lot of stuff that happens in schools isn't anything like that. So how can we use this language of transformation to be really clear about what we are able to do and what the limits on our action might be? And here are 6 suggestions that are kind of in no way derived from Freire, but kind of fall out of thinking about it, for me at least. So, and I'm just going to whiz through these very quickly. You can read them yourself. Transformational knowledge that helps. I think what's really important here is that children's rights educators that get it right, I think, are often doing a double job. They're teaching the formal curriculum and the knowledge that is required, but they're also teaching an additional curriculum that gives the young people that critical perspective, that gives them the alternative ways of seeing and understanding the world, that gives them the minority views. In educational terms, we might think about the next step as being a kind of the establishment of a rights-based schema that enables them to make connections across the world in different ways. Oh, that's me done. And to see the world in different ways so that rights is a kind of routine thing that crops up when you look at the world, when you think about the news, when you talk to people about social events. Transforming agency and the classroom and our commitment to learning through experience and not just seeing everything as rooted in the curriculum delivered in the 4 walls of the classroom is important, because all of those things give children the chance to be people with human rights, to be the holders and the actors of human rights, which is what they are. It's the status they are given, or the status that's recognized in the convention. Over the years, I've come to think of it like this, really, that if this is the expansion of children's agency, it's really important to plot your path and not beat yourself up because children aren't ready to take on responsibility or your school leadership won't let you. The point is that if you're there at the beginning, then you want to nudge your way along and do something different. But if you're further along already, because you're in a progressive school or a fantastic department, or you have inherited a community where there are these more radical relations already, then you go there. And eventually, what I think is really exciting about children's rights education is that once we have kind of really ramped up the capacity of young people to share, to assume agency and to work with us in different ways, then there are new educational possibilities that it's impossible to set out in advance. In this, I'm drawing on McKenna, who wrote a book about pragmatic feminist utopian thinking. And essentially what I took from that is this idea that you don't need to define what liberation looks like. If it's built into your processes and your processes liberate people, then liberated people will dream new utopian visions as they work together. And that's where we should be investing our efforts, rather than trying to define some end state of perfection of what children's rights education looks like when it's implemented. And there I will stop before my alarm goes off for a 3rd time. So that's that, if you like, that's my kind of mishmash. The chapter is in the chat for anyone that wants to read the slightly more refined and argued position. But I'll...
Great. Thank you so much, Lee. That was such a rich presentation. And there have been a few questions that have come up as you were presenting, and a few now towards the end. Does anybody actually want to pose their question directly to Lee, or do you want me to be the conduit? I don't really mind. We had a question from Paris. Are you there, Paris? Do you want to pose that directly?
Yeah, sure, I can. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for that. And I think my question was more of a, like, I really appreciate the work that you've put together. So mine was like this kind of critical, pushing it even, further pushing it forward. And I was just sort of reflecting on, given the fact that the government, it's ongoing and they're really working to restrict the agency that teachers and schools have and the kind of information that they can include in the curriculum. How authentic can we be in it? I know we have to start from somewhere, but I suppose how authentic can we be if we're restricted from talking about things like anti-capitalism or being critical of race? I'm not sure what the question is, I suppose, but how do you see us working towards that, maybe?
Yeah, and that's what that final slide's about, really, I suppose, and those thinking about the ways in which we can attempt to be transformational. I think it's just really important to be honest. I think what I spent some time interviewing people around Europe about policy and practice, and it struck me that people are very good on rhetoric, because the rhetoric of children's rights is really seductive, and because talking about rights is powerful. But we often over talk what we're able to do. So I think rule number one for me is just to be realistic about what you're able to do. And if the young people ask, then explain why that's all you can do and why you can't do any more at the moment. That seems to me a perfectly reasonable conversation to have with people. But I also used to say to trainee teachers, don't get yourself sacked. I mean, the children you're teaching need good people to teach them more than they need heroes to be sacked so they get replaced by people who won't ask questions. So there's a job of political literacy for us, I think, and also a job of building communities. So for 20 years, I've been kind of helping the Association for Citizenship Teaching, and I think our main purpose is to be a place for teachers to come to and lean on each other when they need some help.
Okay, we've got time for another couple of questions. So Karim, are you there? You posed a question. Or shall I read it out? Okay, so Karim asks, thanks, Lee, for this thought-provoking presentation. Combining human or children rights with critical pedagogy is a great idea. As far as I'm concerned, Manisha Bajaj has done this and developed a novel conceptualization of HRE. I think she calls it critical human rights education. I wonder if your conceptualization of children's rights differs from her critical HRE model. If so, how?
Yeah, Manisha Bajaj is the most referenced person in the book. So there's kind of not a chapter where she hadn't already got to the question first. So I think all we're really doing is focusing much more on school teachers and the formal educational experience. So the third part of the book is really focusing on, so what does this mean for the classroom? What does it mean across the school? What does it mean for the school's community relationships? And I think Manisha Bajaj has a much broader kind of sweep over human rights education. And so we're trying to be much more focused on working with children in the formal school context. But yeah, I mean, and in the early discussion about people who talk about transformational HRE, then Bajaj is one of the key reference points. But there are lots of other people who talk about the transformational potential as well, all with their slightly different gloss. So there's, I don't think there's anything we're saying that's massively at odds with what she says.
Okay, we've got another question here from Justin McDermott. Thanks, Lee, from Freires' work, specifically, who are the oppressors in the UK education? Or is this more a critique of capitalism and the ideology with it?
I think it's the whole, I mean, I'm pretty sure a Freirean approach would lead you to look at the role of education in contemporary society and the recurrent predictable patterns of injustice and the people who struggle to have their rights fully realized. And that's the oppressive system that you need to make the object of your study. I think it's easier to do as a teacher if you free yourself from thinking you have to have worked out what the political solution is. Telling the children what the political solution is probably now against the law in the UK. But helping them think about the nature of the struggle and helping them to come to their own political understanding is exactly in the spirit of Freire, the convention, and I think the curriculum.
Great. We've got time for another couple of questions. So Jeremy Clark asks, would it be fair to say that if the processes of thickening children's agency begins as early as possible, i.e. the early years, then they stand a better chance of it being impactful? I think in early years, children are more naturally accepting of these ideas and the classroom procedures are able to be changed to accept this approach.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and the convention says very clearly in Article 12, it's about, I can't remember the exact wording, but it says in all of this has to be interpreted in relation to the child's capacity for sharing responsibility for those decisions and understanding those decisions. So I think the earlier you start, the more you build that capacity. I think the really important thing about understanding children's agency is it's no good waiting passively for them to arrive one day with agency to make decisions. You have to build that with them through the routines, through the culture of the school. I suppose I would also just add, I don't think, I'm a secondary teacher originally by training, but I don't think it's just young children who are better at this. I suspect it's early years professionals and primary teachers who are better at living with the grey area around their authority and working in more creative ways with young people. I think as a year 7 tutor in the past, I've probably done my fair bit pre-conscientisation to squeeze that out of 11-year-olds, because the secondary school often is set up on different principles.
Now, I'm fairly certain that this conversation could carry on for the rest of the day, and it's such an incredibly rich and thought-provoking, really important presentation. So thank you so much, Lee. Are you happy for people to send you any further questions, comments directly to you? And if so, yeah, okay, so that's l.jerome@mdx.ac.uk. And yeah, so I'm going to stick to time, which means I have 30 seconds to thank you all very much for coming along and for being here with us for the launch of our 2021 seminar series. And we hope to see you at the other seminars every other week. As I said, the next one's the 22nd of February, so please pop it in your diary, sign up, and we look forward to seeing you again. And finally, just to say a humongous thank you to Lee Jerome for an incredible paper. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cheers, Lee.